Shalom from Jerusalem and welcome to this program, Messiah in the Torah. Torah is the Hebrew word that is translated as law in our Bibles, but actually the word means teaching. And it's the word used about the law of Moses. Yeshua Jesus said that Moses wrote about me. And that's what we are going to look at in this program here today, what Moses wrote about Yeshua Jesus. That's why we call it Messiah in the Torah. And in fact, in this program, we're going to find one of the most clearest predictions of the gospel in the Torah. And it's called VaYera, this Torah portion. It means he appeared. But I want us to go to straight on here now to chapter 22 in the book of Genesis. And let's see what the Torah has to say about the Messiah. We're reading from verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, when we read verse 2 here, so we are on a treasure hunt here now. This is your spiritual discovery channel. Because in the Torah, we see a shadow of the Messiah. What is real in him is pictured in shadows and in images. And here in this chapter, we're going to find some amazing treasures. When we read verse 2 here, when God tells Abraham to go and offer his son, his only son, we are immediately reminded about John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. So here we immediately find the story here is all about the son, Isaac, that is being offered just like God, the Father, gave us his son for our salvation. This command now by God to Abraham to sacrifice his only son is the final of the tests that Abraham went through. His faith was tested 10 times, and this is the 10th and ultimate test. And I want us to go to the book of James, Yaakov, to read about what we find in this text here in the Torah portion. Yaakov, James, chapter 2, and we are going to read here from verse 20. It says, Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone, or by deeds and not by faith alone, because faith without works, faith without deeds, is no real faith. It's a dead faith. And it's because Abraham had a real faith. He stood the test when he was tested about sacrificing his only son. And it says here that Abraham was called a friend of God. I want to say something about this expression, friend of God, or friend in general. Whenever you see that phrase in the Bible, it is referring to something much more than what we connect with the word friend today. A friend in the Bible is a covenant partner. And that's what Abraham was with God. God and Abraham had a covenant together. They made a covenant, and because they had this covenant, they were partners together, or friends. And we see now in this story when Abraham is willing to sacrifice the most precious thing that he had, his only son, how he acted in faithfulness to the covenant, and he really became then, because of this, a friend of God. Because in a covenant, in the biblical sense, two parties, they agree that everything that each one has also belongs to his covenant partner, to his friend. That is why now Abraham is tested to see, God is finding out if Abraham really is fulfilling his part of the covenant. So that's what this story is all about. And of course we know that God then responded in kind by giving his only begotten Son for all of us, that we might be saved. But we're going to read on here now and see what it says in the text. Verse 3, so Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. I want to comment on this expression, the place, because it is also a very powerful expression in the Torah. God spoke to Abraham about a very special place. And that place really is referring to Golgotha. It is also used about the temple in Jerusalem. Let's read on in verse 4 here. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. He is seeing the place. What place is it? It is really Golgotha, that speaks about the death and the resurrection of the Messiah. Whenever you find, this is something that Abraham saw when he looked up, and in the distance he saw the place on the 3rd day. And this is another clue here that we find in the Torah. Whenever we see the phrase the 3rd day, it is always referring to the resurrection. In fact, even the number 3, even if it doesn't say the 3rd day, whenever we have the number 3, you usually always can see a connection to resurrection. I want us to go to Luke chapter 24 and see what our Master is saying there himself about this with the 3rd day. Luke 24, from verse 45. Actually, I want to read from verse 44 for the sake of context here. This is Yeshua, Jesus, appearing to his disciples after his resurrection. And he says, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, or in the Torah of Moses, and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. And that's our prayer in this series, Messiah in the Torah, that God would open our eyes to see, just like David prayed, King David prayed, that I might see wonderful things in your Torah, that we might see these secrets that are there about the gospel and about the Messiah. We read on in verse 46, and said to them, thus it is written, that the Christ, the Messiah, should suffer, and on the 3rd day rise from the dead. Now I challenge you, you can go from beginning to the end in the so-called Old Testament, with the Hebrew scriptures, and look at every verse, there is not one time that it says the Messiah shall suffer and rise again on the third day. Not even once. And yet, Yeshua Jesus is saying here that this is what is written. It was the interpretation, the revelation in the scriptures is that it's all about the Messiah dying and being raised to life again on the third day. Amazing. And that's what we are finding in this story. When we read about the third day, let's also go to a text now in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to read from verse 17 to 19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. So, in other words, I want to stop here and say, Isaac was the promised son that God had spoken to Abraham about, that I will give you a son through your own wife Sarah, and it is through him that all the promises will be fulfilled. And now God is asking him to sacrifice his only son. In other words, putting to death the very promise that God had given him. But let's read on what he actually believed in here, Abraham now, in verse 19. Abraham considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So Abraham had faith in the resurrection of his son. And that's really what he saw on the third day. When he looked up and he saw the place, he did not just see a physical place. Yeshua Jesus said that Abraham saw my day and he rejoiced. He saw the resurrection of the Messiah and believed that he would receive Isaac back from the dead. So this is what the story is all about. Let's read on here in the text now. Verse 5. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. So here we see the faith of Abraham, that he's telling his servants, I and the boy Isaac, we're going over to that place that God has spoken to me about, and we are going to come back. That is faith in the resurrection. And that's what Abraham had. He saw the good news. He saw the gospel. He saw the day of Messiah. Well, let's read on now from verse 6. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. The Hebrew word for wood here is the same word that is used about the cross that Yeshua Jesus bore on his back on the way to Calvary, to Golgotha. So here we once again see Abraham is placing the wood on the back of Isaac, just like Yeshua, the Messiah, bore the cross for you and I. He laid it on his son Isaac, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. I want to say something here about Isaac. From growing up in church and in Sunday school, I pictured that Isaac was probably around 12 years of age when Abraham was to sacrifice him. But if we study the Torah and the context in the chapters before and after, we will find out that Isaac was at least 30 years old when Abraham was about to sacrifice him. Personally, I think that he was probably exactly the same age as Yeshua, Jesus, when he died at the age of 33. So in other words, Isaac was not just a little boy that had to hold his daddy's hand. He was a grown-up man. He was mature. He could have run away anytime he wanted to. But here we see the submission of Isaac to his father, just like we see in the Messiah when he was obedient all the way unto death, even death on a cross. That's what we see pictured here in Isaac. He was the obedient son. It says twice in the context here that they went on together. They walked together. Just like Messiah prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, if I can escape this, Father, take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will be done, but yours. And that's what we see here in the story. And then in verse 8, it says that Abraham said he had faith. God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And we're going to see later on here in the story how God truly did that. This lamb for the sacrifice was provided by God, and that's a prefigure of the Messiah who took our place that we did not have to die. Verse 9, when they came to the place, here we see the expression again, the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. The word in the Hebrew here that is used about Isaac being bound, it's called in the Hebrew the binding of Isaac. This story is called the binding of Isaac, and the word in the Hebrew is the akedah, the binding. And it's the only time in the entire Hebrew Bible that this word is used. It's a very unique word, this word akedah. And according to the foremost Jewish scholar and interpreter of the Torah, the Rashi, who lived in the 11th century, he says that this word akedah, the binding, it refers to a very special act that Abraham did. When he bound Isaac, he bound his hands and his feet together on the back of Isaac, and he tied the rope. You have to understand now, the Rashi did not believe in the story about the crucifixion, but yet he describes this binding in such a way that it refers to how Abraham bound the hands and feet of Isaac so hard that afterwards, when Isaac took away the ropes, you could see the marks on both the hands and the feet of Isaac. How clearly this is picturing how the Messiah was crucified for us, and they nailed him to the tree, both of his hands and his feet. And according to tradition, Isaac was the one who asked to be bound in this way so that he could not move when the knife was going over his neck. He said to his father, then I might be not accepted as a sacrifice if I resist. In Isaiah 53 and verse 7, it talks about the Messiah being led to death like a lamb that is led to the slaughter without making any resistance whatsoever. So here we see in Isaac the picture of the Messiah being obedient unto death, even death on the cross. So let's read on here in the text. Verse 10. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So we see Abraham, he was faithful, he had faith, he stood the test, he was willing to give up the most precious thing he had, and that's why he was called, just like Jacob, James says, he was called the friend of God. It's mentioned twice in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's talking about in Isaiah and as well as in 2 Chronicles about Abraham, God's friend, God's covenant partner. And we see here also that he took his knife, and according to tradition, he put the knife to Isaac in such a way that he even died for a moment. We don't see that in the text, but it's amazing how the Jewish people picture it that way, that really Isaac was raised to life from the dead. Well, he is the picture of the Messiah who died and was raised to life on the third day. Let's read on in verse 13. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. Once again, the Hebrew word for thicket here is the same word that is used about the thorns that were on as a crown on the head of Messiah when he was crucified. And the same word in the Hebrew is used about this thicket that had caught this ram by the horns. We see here then the picture of the substitute that took Isaac's place, just as Yeshua Jesus has taken our place by being put to death, giving up his life for you and I, that we would escape and have everlasting life. So let's read on here in verse 13. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So here in the where it says that the Lord shall provide, in the Hebrew it is Yod Hei Vav Hei Yireh. And the Jewish rabbis say this is the first part in the name Jerusalem. Jerusalem. It comes from this word Yireh, because Jerusalem is the mountain of the Lord where he has provided salvation for you and I. Jerusalem is the place where the Messiah died as a substitute in our place, and God provided salvation for all of mankind. And that's what we see here through the ram that took the place of Isaac. And it happened on the mountain of the Lord. It says, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. We know this was on in the land of Moriah. In fact, it was on the Mount Moriah, as it was later on called, where we see in 2 Chronicles 3 and verse 1, where exactly on Mount Moriah was where Solomon built the temple, because it was the chosen place. And in John chapter 11, I want us to look at something here, where it says in verse 48, John 11:48. If this is Caiaphas, the high priest, who's saying, if we let him, that is Jesus, Yeshua, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. What is that referring to? We can see in other parts of the scripture it was referring to the temple. The temple was called the place. because it is the place that God has chosen to provide on the mount of the Lord the salvation for all of mankind through Golgotha. Golgotha was actually a place that belonged to the temple, even though it was outside of the temple. We can see that in the book of Hebrews. I will not go into that now, but it was really the place God had chosen in the land of Moriah for the Son of Man, the Messiah, to give up his life for you and I. So we see how the Torah is prophesying the gospel so clearly in this story about Isaac, who was willing to give up his life. And so he's a picture as the son of the Messiah, but also the substitute, the ram, is the one who is picturing the substitute sacrifice that happened on Golgotha. Now it's interesting when we read on in the text here, it says that afterwards, that in verse 19, so Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. Where is Isaac? It only says that Abraham returned, not Isaac. Well, in the following chapters, we will find that Isaac is not mentioned again in the Torah until he meets his wife, Rebekah, his bride. In the same way, Isaac is then a picture of how the Messiah, after his death and his resurrection, he was caught up into heaven, and he has not been seen ever since. He will not be seen again until he returns to get his bride, you and I. I hope that you have learned and seen some wonderful things from the Torah in this program here today. If you want to have more, there's so much more here in the Torah portion this week that I don't have the time to touch on. You can go to our website, thewatchman.org, and you can subscribe to Weekly Torah, where you will get much, much more than I had time to tell you about in this session. So God bless you, and shalom from Jerusalem until next week.